It's me, name's Sonny. Give us a moment. Before I do the intro, I'm just gonna jump into that bucket. Woohoo! Ah! Yeah, I made it! I made it! Oh, I didn't make it. I think I'm outside the bucket. Well, that was a complete failure. You can put that in there and start the video. It's me, name's Sonny. Welcome to Boneworks. Today is another How It Works video. Ooh, it's been a while since I attempted to make this video again. Close? You can't lock me out. Anyways, open sesame. Let's get out of that loud, noisy room and have a look at what we are talking about today. So today's video, of course, it's How It Works on Boneworks, but we are going to cover this in probably small bits. Why? Because the game kind of difficult to describe in one video. Of course, with the Half-Life Alyx videos, I did exactly this, and their mechanics are actually much simpler to describe, which makes it nice and easy to cover. With this game, it's a little bit more complicated. Why? Because that's the whole point of the game. The game is entirely mechanics, which is beautiful. High five. And he kind of low fives instead. Right, so best way to start with this video is probably to have a look at the diagram, which was provided to us by Monaghan Industries. But instead of doing that, I'm going to talk about that in a moment. The first thing I want to talk about is some sort of theory, some concept ideas. Movement in VR, in general, is a bit of a weird one to get your head around. And this is something that you'll notice no matter who you are. If you haven't done VR before, and you're sort of getting into game development for VR, it gets a little bit difficult. Because on a regular game, what you would do is when you're moving a character, it's very simple. Your player themselves, so we're talking about the real world person here, the real world person is essentially just a camera. They're just viewing the world from their position, from their screen. So all you have to do really to move around a player, move them around the game world, is to move the camera itself. That's very simple in a normal game. With VR, you can't do that, because that part of it is actually beyond your control. You have to sort of reconceptualize something that you thought you knew when it comes to game development. Where now, instead of having just the camera view, you're literally just a nothing object shown to the player. Instead, you kind of have more objects that are coming from the real world as well. The inputs are no longer just buttons on a controller. Now the inputs are actually the tracking as well. So what you have to do is take one step into the game and relieve control over your systems. That is actually what we're talking about there at the top. So that's the first element on our diagram over here, the controller rig. And it's very important to consider that as one piece. Why? Because in reality, if we ignore the physics here and we look at our menus, so again, same with the Half-Life Alyx, where when we ignore our physics, we can see that we have got tracking separate to our physics objects. And you can see here that this pointer follows my tracking because the menu always runs off tracking, not off the physics. What we've got there is a physics hand, is a tracking hand, sorry, we're going to ignore physics. And then the same thing on the other hand. And then, of course, the same thing for my head tracking. All of those three pieces always stay in sync with each other, in relation to each other, and in relation to a single point in space, in real world space, which is, of course, your tracking center. Now, for myself, I'm kind of standing in the tracking center in my real world. So if we just drop something to denote that. So here we are. I'm standing on there. I'm not going to move my joystick. So you can see on my left hand, if I move my joystick, you will see my thumb closing up. I'm not going to move my joystick, and you can see that I can move around in my real world space, moving away from that center point. The problem is when you move your player in the real world, in a game, what you have to do with VR is you can't just move the head, because if you move the head, this will happen. Whoop! Everything gets offset. Your hands are no longer being tracked in the correct position because your head has been offset, And the overall VR system cannot understand that because the tracking origin says that actually I'm standing here. You just joystick moved my camera. That's wrong, that's unacceptable. You can't just move all three, because if you move the head tracking and the hands again, you're going to have this offset, where your tracking center, again, your VR system, it's not designed for that, it's going to correct it all the time. So what you have to do is you have to move all of them. So when I joystick move, in reality, the actual center point, the entire VR origin, i.e. the VR rig, the controller rig, the entire thing has to move with me, right? And that's the element that you have to understand. And that's where this kind of stuff gets a little bit difficult. I think my computer's glitching a little bit, it's probably loading something. That's where this whole thing gets a little bit difficult. Because what you have to do is consider that all of your tracking is one single piece. Essentially what you're doing, if you look out the window in your room right now, if you're in your room, and imagine that your whole room was removed from the house and sliding down the street. Your head would stay in the same place relative to the room, your hands would stay in the same place relative to the room, but when you look out the window, your view, your entire room will be moving and your view will be able to move along that world outside. That's exactly what you're doing in VR. You're moving the entire player's room, because that room is essentially their room scale space. That's the VR tracking. The whole controller rig is moving the entire player's room. You're taking their bedroom, you're taking their surrounding, and the whole thing you're moving through VR. This results in a problem. Let's have a look at the VR physics rig first, and then we'll see where the problem lies. So, we've got a physics rig here. So this is essentially a nice hierarchy that we've got here. The physics rig, which is one step after the controller rig, remember, we're not talking about visuals here. What you see is not what you get, okay? What you see is not true physics. That's all animation. This beautiful stuff here, it doesn't exist in the game world, as you can see from the fact that my gun can go through it. These physics objects do exist, but the animation does not. That's the skeleton part. That's the real-time or simulation rig, whichever one is which. Let's have a look at the physics first. So again, the physics rig contains all the calculations, mass and jointing for all the body solver physics. Let's have a look at the body solver physics. Here we are. It's actually much simpler than what you think you see. There's no legs, there's no feet, there's no arms. Why? Because what you need is you need a way of moving through the world while also keeping an understanding of that controller rig, the entire VR structure. So, a very, very cool idea that Brandon came up with here was this idea of the Locomotion sphere. Now, they've given you nice information, so you could literally replicate this in your own engine or whatever. It's a 0.2 meter radius, blah, blah, blah. High friction. Very, very important. Essentially what it does is it just rolls you around. Now, you may have played a game called, what's it called? Marble Madness. Or another game, if you're like me, and you play Sierra games, you may have played a game called Switchball. Really cool game. You can't play on Windows 10. It will not work. You'll need an older version of Windows to play it. Or a virtual machine, of course. Yeah, where you play as a ball and you just roll it through the world. But it's full physics. So all you're doing when you push the analog stick is roll the ball. You accelerate it. You essentially just apply force. You apply torque to that ball. That's exactly what's going on here. When I'm in air, that ball rolls, but there's no friction, there's no ground or anything to push on it. So what happens is only when you're on ground can you actually roll with it. The problem with that, of course, is when you're standing on something that can also move. So here we have a box that will also move. Here we have a box that will also move, and you can see as I move, my feet, or actually my sphere, my rolly ball, my locomotion ball, actually causes the object below me to move instead. And that's because, quite simply put, there's high friction. The idea is the ball pushes this way, the ball pushes this way, the person goes that way. And of course the ground gets pushed. But if the real world ground is not able to be pushed, then all of that force just gets transferred to me as a character. So it's all useful. And of course that keeps our complete consistency between the player's movement physics and the game world physics. Now there's a problem with this. Imagine you tried to roll that ball now here on an edge or here on a wall. And you can see that I just slide along the wall. At no point, even in nice slow motion, at no point does my ball push me upwards, vertically upwards. If you imagine having a sort of a spherical object, let's run through here and get back in here. Whee! Whoop! And grab this ball here, right? If you imagine that this ball is attempting to roll, or we could just do this. I love doing this. I'll explain that in a bit as well. I might explain that in another video. So again, here what happens is we've got a ball. It applies a torque to rotate and starts rolling. The problem is if that happens to get close to a wall, this will happen. It'll roll and then it'll continue rolling and it'll push upwards. You see how that happens? It pushes upwards. So what will end up happening is you'll get a sort of bounce. Well, it doesn't work very well with this ball, but there are some bouncy balls down there that I can probably try as well. It'll roll, it'll push on there, and then gravity will take effect and it'll bounce down again. That you're not seeing happen. As you can see, I hit the wall and I never lift off the ground. That's because there's actually a second sphere. So we have a second sphere here. This one here. And that one, they've named the Fender Collider. So this is where you start to get an understanding of what's actually going on. Think about it. We have a rolling ball that moves along the ground by pushing on it, by rolling and pushing with friction. And then you have a shielding object called a fender. Essentially, our player is a vehicle. What you're dealing with here, and this is something that I've described in my platforming games as well. What you're dealing with when you're dealing with a player like this, and you're working with a certain level of game physics, you're dealing with something that essentially acts as a car. It acts as a vehicle. Here we've got a quite literal vehicle. We've got a ball that moves, that rotates, and pushes you essentially as a motor, and then you've got a fender that protects from certain things. Now a real world fender probably doesn't protect from you rolling up walls, but at least this one does. And you can see here the exact inverse happening. Prevents kickback, under the knee RB, so you've got an under knee rigged body, so this is where the knees are here. And then you've got zero friction, so the exact opposite of the other one, which is high friction. It's zero friction, it means that I can slide along the wall. And that's brilliant. Brilliant, that's exactly what we want. We want something that can roll us along the ground, affect physics objects, or if we jumped on top of here, affect physics objects by rolling them, and all at the same time not roll up walls. Brilliant. So that deals with our problem. Now we've got a further issue. We have a character body. So you're probably imagining all of this time that when we roll that ball, it's very simple. Our character just moves. Our camera tracking and our controller rig can just move with it. But that's not the case. You see, if our controller rig was sitting on the ball, we've got a huge problem because that ball is going to rotate. We're going to be tilting all over the place, right? So it can't be sitting on that. So you're probably saying, okay, well, it can sit on the Fender Collider. Yeah, it can. Except it also can't. There's a little bit of a complexity going on now. Because once you've got your entire rig sitting on that Fender Collider, what happens is you can push your joystick and move your entire character along. That's fine. You'll move your camera. But what happens if I then take a step forward in my real world space? So here we are, standing in our room scale center, and now I take a step forward. Well, then we've got a problem because either that ball stays there and I just move my camera, or, and that can't happen because then we've lost the physics of the ground, we've lost the consistency there, or it actually applies that motion that I've made in the real world to the Locomotion ball. But the problem with that is you'll end up with double motion. Why? Because I'll take a step forward and then the whole rig will roll forward. So now we've got double the motion. And that's definitely not the case. So what you end up having to do is offset the Locomotion space by the amount that you're taking a step with. So if I take a step here, in order to get that ball to move here, you have to move the whole locomotion space back one step. It may not make complete sense, but it's kind of necessary. That's essentially what's happening. You convert the real world motion, that step forward, into the physics motion of the character, which will actually make that step forward. And as a result, you end up in the same position that you started in your VR tracking space. So within your room scale, if you looked at it within that sort of character body structure, in this case we're on the Fender, you end up just moving, correcting yourself into the center of that Fender. So here we are. Whoop. So you move from here, you move, the center corrects itself, so you end up back in the center of the Fender collider, which had then also applied that motion and rolled along. Brilliant. In fact, it's probably best if I kind of did it like this. I should probably use the ball on top of it. There we go. Brilliant. Brilliant way of describing things. Anyways, so that's where there's already complexity. We haven't even gotten above the bloomin' feet yet, and we've already got stuck with some problems. Some really confusing problems. Let's get even more complicated, because this game goes full physics. We're not faking anything, so they are not faking anything when it comes to this character structure. When we're playing this game, we're not faking. There's just no fakery here, right? It's all physics, which means when we jump, what they are doing is they are actually pushing on the ground with the physics character, which of course means that all of what I just told you about sitting the camera rig, the controller rig on that Fender collider, it doesn't actually work, because you'll see that in a moment. We're going to ignore the legs for a second here. We're going to ignore this lower collider. This upper collider is the thing that kind of matters. Now, I've actually already done my recreation side of things for this How It Works series for Boneworks. All up to accepting grabs, right? So I haven't done the grab system at all, but everything including the hand physics, I have recreated this sort of structure. And from what I've seen in their more recent videos, I think in the updates they actually updated this structure and they've got a second collider here, and not just the box. The box, I think, acts as the shoulders. So what they've got here is actually a piece here which acts as the hip, and then a piece above that actually acts as the upper body. But that doesn't really matter. It all kind of sits the same way. This sort of upper body, this hip structure here, is actually this pelvis rigid body. And that's actually rotation locked. Now, there's a very big reason that you would rotation lock something like that. And that's because the same reason that we had for locking the Fender before, we don't want the VR sort of controller rig, the sort of room scale space, to be rolling about and tilting and rotating. So what you do is you actually lock the piece that you're moving it with. And that pretty much hints to you exactly where the VR rig is sitting, the controller rig. It's actually not sitting on there, because if it sat on there, I wouldn't be able to do fake crouching. Instead, it sits on this upper body here. Now, this is all from my own sort of guesstimates, and it could be wrong, but I've kind of replicated this system with that sort of logic, so it is possible to do it that way. They may have done it a completely different way, and that's perfectly fine. All in all, what you end up with is the same concept, and that's what we're talking about in all of these videos, is the idea of the concept that you've gone with. You can basically recreate or improve upon this yourself, right? So here we've got a rotation locked piece, which essentially acts as a spring point from this body, from this structure down here. So if we now imagine that we've got essentially two structures, we've got the feet, which actually control all of the movement along the ground, around the ground. God, there's some difficult words going on today. We've got the feet structure here that controls all of our ground movement. And then we've got our VR structure here, which actually controls our upper body and what we see. So this structure here, and everything connected above, is connected to our VR rig. This chest piece here, the hip, the pelvis rigged body, is our main structure, with the head sitting on it. But that head rigid body is just a rigid body for the sake of collisions. It doesn't actually impact our camera movement. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's almost completely locked in place, but it does rotate. It's not rotation locked. It does rotate, though I don't know whether it rotates through physics. It doesn't really need to. It can be completely solid with this piece. It essentially acts as a sort of rotating part of the upper body piece, the hip piece. So we still have only two structures. We've got the feet that control our ground movement, and then the control structure, the VR structure, which is everything above the upper body. And I've still once again missed out this piece here. So what is that piece? What is that leg piece, that leg sort of looking thing? Well, in actuality, it's not really there. It is, but it also isn't. It's only collision there. Again, same as the head, that part is purely for collision. It's just there to stop things from going through my body here. That's all it is. And it actually changes shape, which is an unusual situation. Now, I would highly recommend anyone playing with changing shape of rigid bodies. The whole point of a rigid body is that it doesn't change shape. That's why it's called a rigid body. So if you are playing with something like that, go ahead and do a lot of performance tests first to see what works and what really burns out the performance, because you can really mess up some performance structures when you're dealing with changing shapes of rigid bodies. So be careful with that. But what actually happens here on the physics side is that we've got this upper body, the hip structure, sitting on the feet structure. And what that means is we've got a spring joint that acts the same way that I'm crouching here. It actually pushes down when I hold my jump button, and then when I release my jump button, it pushes out. So what you actually get is this whole structure, including the whole VR tracking system, sitting on top of that, going down by squeezing that spring and then pushing out to jump. And that's why when you push your head up, you know, when I just press the button and then let go, I get a jump, right? There we go, nice jump. But when I actually put some effort into it, I get an even higher jump. The reason being that we're actually accelerating ourselves up. Because as I crouch in reality, or if I use the actual crouch mechanic in game, that's all the same stuff. It squeezes this spring. And by controlling that manually, you are also increasing the acceleration going upwards. So you get a higher jump. In other words, this is a completely physical replication, a simulation of a real-world person. You would squeeze your legs and then push, and that's how you handle your movement. That's the spring joint element. It's all sort of a replication, a simulation of the real-world person. I think this video has gone on long enough. Now, I don't know how much of this I'm going to cut together and put together well, but as you can see, it's a very difficult thing to describe all of this without going into like an hour or 2 hours. So I'm going to leave it there. We're gonna stop at a very, very simple piece. Now, all of this is just talking, I know. It's difficult to get through, and it's a necessity because you want to really fully understand that physics rig first before we move on to the hands, because this is where things get a little confusing. The hands, they're actually made up of multiple pieces, and each of those have different friction settings, and they act as different pieces. They act with different structures. Some are rigid bodies, some are just collision. It gets complicated, and then grabbing gets a little bit more complicated. So we're going to leave it there. I'm sorry if this video was a little bit more boring and a little bit less easy to understand than the Half-Life Alyx How It Works videos, but there's so much more to cover now that I wanted to just get started. I've been wasting weeks, so I'm sorry about that. What we should do is probably end the video here. Thanks very much for watching, and I shall see you in the next one.